Coming up, the Brooklyn Nets continue their way through a 500-level season with no championship aspirations. What is the one scenario where Mikal Bridges could be on the move? Houston, we have a trade.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there, you'll find Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Arbrecht. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use promo code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. And Doug, right after the organization decides to sit all of their starters, although Mikal Bridges played just to keep that streak alive, it does bring up the question, is there any scenario as the trade deadline approaches where we would say, yes, Mikal Bridges, you can pack your bags and prepare to play for another team?
Yeah, so we thought a lot about this, and we were trying to think about just sort of the path of the Nets as an organization and sort of what the next few years, maybe many years, look like coming out of the Big Three era where they had to give up a lot to put that team together and got back a lot to break, to sort of, and in some cases to sort of disassemble the team, and sort of where they're left now in terms of assets and picks and players and all this other stuff, and sort of what the future looks like. And we've run through a lot of different scenarios with the Nets around what should be done and what might, be the comfortable way, maybe low ceiling, comfortable way to go about this job for Sean Marks and company, and what might be the slightly uncomfortable but much higher upside and controllable version of this team going forward.
Right.
And really the only way to do the second one that the Nets have is to consider the idea of at some point, maybe this year or maybe next year, be more likely of trading Mikal Bridges. Yeah. And that would be a very tough pill to swallow because of what Mikal Bridges means, both from the piece that came in for Kevin Durant and how good he's been and just sort of the face of the team and kind of the exact guy you want to be the face of your team, just a all around great guy. And we're here to tell you that there is one scenario where the Nets should very, very strongly think about doing it if it was even available. And I actually think that it is realistic based on where these teams are. And that would be thinking about really pressing on the gas about trying to trade him to the Rockets. And we could talk about what that means. But this is the one scenario where I would actually actively be proactive in trying to do it with Mikal Bridges, but no other scenario. Let's kind of talk about what that means.
Yeah, of course. The Houston Rockets, who, as we know, the trade for James Harden is where they accumulated a lot of Brooklyn Nets draft capital. And it's why the Brooklyn Nets don't control their own fate. We said it can't be a tanking team. You don't have your own picks. So the primary reason why you would explore a trade like this, before we even get into why it makes sense for Houston on a player level, on a team level right now, because they have the 2024 first-round pick from Brooklyn with no protections on it. They also have the 2025 first-round pick via OKC or Brooklyn, depending on the more favorable. They also have the 2026 first-round pick via Brooklyn with no protections on it. As you go down the list and realize how much Houston controls the Nets' future in terms of draft capital, this is the one scenario where you'd say, boy, Mikal Bridges means a lot from a perception standpoint for this organization. But if we could control our own destiny over the next few seasons, even with everything we got from Phoenix and what we got from Dallas, this is where if you're the Sean Marks, Joe Tsai, the Nets organization, you have to say, we'd have to take a long, hard look at this. And there's reasons why Houston would be maybe willing to engage in this kind of talk.
Yeah. So, okay. So let's start off with a couple of the reasons why Houston would even think about entertaining a deal like this. Now, I'll say this. We put out a couple scenarios to different people, did poll some Houston Rockets insiders, Jackson Gatlin, over at Locked On Rockets, who's a real level-headed thinker. He's been on the podcast before with some overlap stuff. Floated this idea to him. He was on board, right? Kind of from the outset from this idea. So there's a couple of factors that weigh into this, why a potential Rockets trade with Bridges makes sense. Let's start on a high level. Right now, the way the picks are aligned is that it's worst of both worlds for both teams, right? So the way, and what I mean by this is the Nets is worst of both worlds, worst of their world because they don't have it, right? So because they don't have the but this is important for the next part. Yeah. They don't have it, and so they don't have their own picks. So therefore, their idea, what they need to be as a team is totally different, which is they'd say they need to always keep trying. And as long as they keep trying, because they don't have the picks, Houston is unlikely to get full value off these picks because the Nets are going to try desperately to not be in the lottery because of how bad it would look to have to ship these lottery picks to Houston. Yeah. Like that's a core part of their motivation for sure. It's why they wanted to make the playoffs last year, right? It's why they're going to try to make the playoffs this year. It's why they're going to try to make the playoffs next year. It's why they could think about trading for another superstar with these picks instead of just tanking. Because so as long as the Nets don't have their own pick, Houston's version of the pick will never be the highest value. So that's just for starters why it is a meet in the middle point here with both teams, because they can't hope, except for just like totally getting lucky, to ever have these be like really high lottery picks because the Nets will just never actively tank.
Well, and that's the one interesting thing about this. At the time of the trade, in terms of these picks values, Houston probably looked at all these picks and said, they're never going to be that valuable because it was James Harden going to Brooklyn to join Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant, right? Yeah, so from that lens, I just had this thought in real time, by the way, these picks have gotten better for Houston in theory already, right? But they're never going to sweeten to the level that you would want them to. I'm sure even when they made that move, the idea was we send them James Harden. In the back of our minds, we hope by the time we get out to 26 and 27, we're talking about things didn't work out. They didn't extend these players. They had their good run, and we still have something that could be real high-level valuable for us. So there is a little bit of that involved here, but the thing that's changed for Houston since then is head coach, players they've signed, and what their aspirations are. Because at the time of the trade, it was a bad team that wanted to get some draft capital back and prepare for a rebuild. All of a sudden, they've pivoted kind of their energies as well and what they want to accomplish in the short term.
Right. All of a sudden, and this is so in the Nets' favor here, is that Houston became kind of good.
Yeah.
Right. Like positive point differential on the season. As we're recording this, they're 15 and 14, right? Like they signed veterans like Fred VanVleet and Dylan Brooks in the offseason. Some of these draft picks are starting to hit. So we'll talk about this more in a second, but the way that Houston, their trajectory has changed and the Nets absolutely have to take advantage of it. We'll talk about that here more in 1 second. First, going to tell you about our friends over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made so easy. Prize Picks took away what some of these other daily fantasy operators, parts of the game that just make it hard, like salaries, having to go up against sharks in the water. None of that is here on Prize Picks. All you're doing on Prize Picks is you're taking the most fun part of fantasy, which is going more or less on certain numbers that Prize Picks puts up there. You can win up to 25 times your money, more or less on points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. That's for basketball. Maybe you're over in football, yards, rushing yards, receiving yards, catches, touchdowns. Go more or less on what Prize Picks puts up there. You can even combine some of those players together. So like 3 basketball guys, 3 NBA guys, 2 NFL guys make up your 5, and away you go. Starting on Prize Picks has never been easier. There's there's a reason it's the #1 daily fantasy sports app. All you have to do is go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA. Use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks is daily fantasy sports made easy.
All right, so as we roll along through the seismic potential shift that the Brooklyn Nets could be or should be willing to do in moving Mikal Bridges specifically only to the Houston Rockets, only to get control of their own destiny. Now, the one thing that I do want to note about this is, and I think sometimes gets lost in it, it's the same thing about talking about the Phoenix picks for the Brooklyn Nets and what that could look like a few years from now and having high draft value. Remember, like the NBA did change things a little bit. You can be one of the top 4 worst teams in the lottery order, and it's 14% lottery probability of getting the #1 overall pick for the first 3 teams. Then it's 12.5%. 10.5% all the way down at the 5th spot. At the 6th spot, it's 9% chance. We've seen this play out in recent years where just because you have the quote best percentage, it's no longer as heavily weighted where it's a guarantee. And this is one thing that I do wonder about when we talk about these picks in this specific scenario and getting them back. Okay, you get them back. But even if we talk about in the short term, well, the Brooklyn Nets already have 15 wins this year. How hard would they have to throttle down to get themselves the best 14% chance to get that top draft pick potentially? I do just wonder how much that factors into any decisions like this, where, yes, it greatly improves your ability. The number one thing being you control your own draft capital, but it's not a guarantee. You could still end
No.
up picking 6th or 7th in the draft while having one of the worst 2 records in the league.
Okay, right. So that is true, right? Like it doesn't guarantee you're going to get a superstar. Just because you tank doesn't mean you get Wembanyama, right? Like you don't get these guys every time. But what we've seen time and time again in the NBA is that the more chances you have to get high pedigree guys,
Yes.
the more chances you have to hit. So yes, it's not always going to be Cooper Flag in 2 years, right? It's not always going to be Boozer. Like it's not going to be one of these guys for sure. But you for sure get more chances with more bites at the apple among the guys that like consensus agree should go in the top 10, right? Yeah, like we always will shift around what the post draft, like what it should have been once we start to see. Like Scoot never goes 3 if they do redo the draft again. Okay, we all agree with this. But the point is you have to give yourself chances to get these guys. Where the Nets are in a terrible position now is that, one, they don't have any bites at the apple. So it's going to be the only way they're going to have to do it. The only way they're going to be able to get better is to use the actual valuable things they have, i.e. the Suns picks, to get better with some of these other guys that might come loose, like Donovan Mitchell, who are never going to get you all the way to the promised land, probably, right? And so the Nets, so the only way to really reset the deck is to think about getting these picks back, right? Like, and that's it sucks because you don't want to go through a tanking process. I actually don't think tanking processes don't even need to be that long at this point, though. Like we've seen it. Houston was tanking. We're talking about trading them Mikal Bridges because they're good now,
Right?
right? Like these don't have to be super extended tanks. Yeah, like you look at Detroit, they stink, and it's hard to see the version of it where they get out. But then you have like OKC. OKC was bad for like 1 year, right? You can sort of like piece these things together, especially if you're bringing along a Cam Thomas, you're bringing along some of these other young guys. Like you combine that with having a chance to have Sean Marks, who we talked about this last episode, actually has a very good draft record. He just doesn't draft enough. Right. They've actually done very, very well overall relative to draft slot through the years, through the Sean Marks era with their draft picks. They just don't. He's just been saddled with never having enough picks, right?
Yeah,
Whether
always
it was
picking
like
in the 20s, but always finding value in those spots as well, right along the way, for sure. And that's so the other thing then about this from a Nets perspective, at least at a minimum, by the way, when you get back your own picks, then you can make decisions that influence where the value of your picks lie, right? Even if it ends up being to trade them for something else, they're still yours. And you see what your team is doing on the court, and then you know what it means you should do with them off of the court. Specifically, when we come to this trade, the other kind of nice thing about this is it doesn't take a lot in order to facilitate this just from like a number standpoint. So when you go and you put the 21.7 of Mikal Bridges' contract over onto Houston, you only need to get back 21.4. And there's a little bit of wiggle room inside of that. What is it that combination of like the picks and players, because you would think that, or do you think, I should say, that Houston is looking at it and going, well, we'll give you back everything, all your picks that you gave to us for James Harden, they're back in your lap? Or let's talk about some of our young players. Let's talk about the money matching here. And if the Brooklyn Nets are more inclined to say, yeah, give me old veteran expiring contracts that get us there, or is there a young guy that we would want to get back onto our roster, whether it's a Jalen Green, whether it's a Thompson? Like there are players on this roster that the Nets might covet here. And I wonder if they'd be willing to sacrifice one of the further down the road first round picks of their own in order to maybe get back a player that they believe can be a core member, that can be a top 25 kind of guy.
Okay, so this is the other thing that where this lines up like almost too perfectly, right? Is that Houston has a lot of young talent on the team with actually, to some degree, like where the Nets are, like not enough minutes to play them.
Right.
Because they've been playing. Ime clearly wants to win. The organization clearly wants to win. Van Vliet is already playing like 40 plus minutes a game, like an insane amount. Şengün is playing a ton, right? Jabari, he got hurt while we were recording this, so I'll have to check in on his status. Either way, he's playing a ton, right? Like, so they have these young guys that are already sort of monopolizing a ton of minutes. Dylan Brooks did just recently get hurt. But they have guys like that they already kind of want to play a ton. So then they're left with, and they're starting Jalen Green, but like, let's see what happens with that, right? He hasn't been as good. But then they have Tari Eason. They have Amen Thompson. They have, well, I mentioned Jalen Green because it's like unclear if he's part of like the vision of what they want to do going forward. They have Cam Whitmore, right? They have guys that they just, Jayshawn Tate, they just have dudes that they just can't actually play all the minutes because their motivations there are sort of screwed up a little bit too. Now they might be able to have their cake and eat it too, like be a decent team and develop young talent. And they might just be like, hey, we're good. We don't need to give the picks up. Like we got a bunch of young guys here. Like, right. And we're pretty good. But the fact that they might be able to consolidate talent around the good core, still keep some young talent like Şengün and Jabari, and like keep those core pieces that they don't want to move on from, and just like upgrade sort of in a spot they need to upgrade at the 3. Like it does make so much sense. So I really think you can mix and match this any different way. The way I originally put it out, it was like Jalen Green and Jeff Green and like basically all the picks back, right? Like that was when that, and I was like, okay, Jalen Green, whatever. It's probably not going to get all the way there for him. Jeff Green just helped kind of fill in the salary. I'm actually not sold on any one package, but it's just to say there's lots of options here. And it's crazy that they're like, all of a sudden, you can mix and match as kind of like to your heart's delight and find probably a good middle ground because all the money works too.
Yeah, well, it's funny too because in that vein, and I think I for the most part, I'm on the same page with you. Any way you want to slice it, you make the money work. You get Mikal Bridges over to there, and away they go. The one thing that I would say though, as kind of a footnote to this, would be guys like Royce O'Neal or guys like Dorian Finney-Smith that we talk about and where's their value and getting picks back for them in any trade, let alone inside of say something like this. If it increases the ability for the Nets to get a better of the younger players, right? A more desired player that they think could fill out long-term, or that increases from saying, we'll give you back 2 of your own first-round picks. Well, we want the 3rd one. I'm also willing to sacrifice in that vein too and say, well, Dorian Finney-Smith may be worth 2 first-rounders in some world to some championship-level team, but that's not as valuable as, and I'm saying that somewhat understanding that that's not really probably where the level is. But let's say that was championship caliber team X wants to give you 2 first-round picks that are going to be back-end first-round picks for Dorian Finney-Smith. That's not as valuable as getting back one of your own first-round picks that or in theory believe could be as valuable as a lottery pick, could be a top 10 pick, right? So I think there's areas in that vein that the Nets would be able to play inside of a trade like this as well. And I bring it up to say, if you're Houston, that's a really good, like having Dorian Finney-Smith for a win now team is really good. That's the whole reason why we talk about his value around the league right now. And based on his contract and Mikal's contract and Fred VanVleet's contract and Dylan Brooks, it fits their timeline too. You can have this kind of veteran heavy team for a couple of years. And then to your point, still maintain that flexibility with some of these younger guys. In a second, let's talk about the other side of this, because we ultimately may think that the Nets have a path going forward that will please no one, but it should either be all in with Houston or going violently the other direction and pursuing some high-end talent. Let's get into that here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our good friends over at FanDuel. Right now, there's no better time to get in on the NBA and end-of-season NFL action than over on FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. You put in $150 if your team wins on that money line, bang. Or excuse me, you put in $5, you're going to get $150 if that team wins. Even better, baby. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. So many different options, too. They have the spreads, the player props, over-unders, so much more. You get the same-game parlays going, especially if you're watching the Nets. You get those same-game parlays. And we know the Nets have been one of the best teams against the spread this year. So that's just even better when you're trying to get in on the action on FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get in on the action this NBA season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL and NBA.
All right, so as we tie a bow on the big trade possibility for the Brooklyn Nets, the one scenario where we would say so long to Mikal Bridges, the Houston Rockets giving back Brooklyn control of their own draft capital and maybe picking up a young talent along the way as well. Now, before we talk about what we think ultimately the Nets will do, which is probably going to be to the ire of all fans across the world, the other thing about this to me is yes, Houston, control your own picks, fantastic. And if not, then spend some of these picks that you have now for not dissimilar reasons, like the Phoenix picks, on going and acquiring more talent to put around Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson and Nicholas Claxton and Dorian Finney-Smith and these veterans. because even as we said about getting back control of your own picks, yes, the Phoenix picks seem sexy and they seem like high value right now. We don't know what happens in another year. We don't know what this insane owner who's willing to spend goes and does. We've talked about before how Joe Tsai doesn't want to live in the luxury tax threshold and doesn't want to have to pay the repeater tax. Doesn't mean Phoenix doesn't want to. And when you're willing to overspend, suddenly not having draft picks and not being able to control your own fate doesn't matter. I'll just throw money at the problem until I solve it by being a deep playoff team. And if that timeline extends even by a year and even by 2 years for their window of winning, then it looks a lot different about how valuable those picks are. I would pivot quickly and say, okay, Donovan Mitchell, we said we don't think he's exactly the right guy, but I would take a look at him and I would take a look at another good player and I would bring in multiple pieces to make this a win now-ish kind of team.
Yeah, and this is always the hardest part, right? Because like, what should your organizational philosophy be, right? Like, in the best version of it is, you know exactly what it is. It's like you're OKC, and you're like, okay, we're just gonna keep accumulating superstars, and we're gonna eventually make a move, right? Or we already have a superstar like a Giannis or an Embiid or a Jokic, and we kind of already know we're building around that guy, and that's just what we're gonna do, right? The Nets aren't in either of those situations, so it's really tough. I am with you. I was on the side of like, hold on to these Suns picks for dear life because you just never know how bad it could be. I think I'm like mostly still there, but for the first time, like what you said, I'm beginning to entertain the possibility that maybe being a little better in the short term, because it's just more fun to watch a basketball team that's good, right? Especially when there's no incentive to be bad. Like you can't even look at, like, if you're the Pistons are a bad example, but because they're so bad, but these other teams like Charlotte, Spurs, like you're looking at them and they're like, oh, we'll still maybe get a high draft pick, and the losing because it still sucks, but whatever. Like the Nets don't even have that. And I do wonder at some point, like, give this a year or 2 years and the Nets like haven't really marginally improved. It's going to be pretty brutal to have watched the team be, 4 games below 500, 5 games below 500 with like not super clear understanding of like where the future is going to go, except for hoping the Suns stink. Like that's just like not a great place to be in as a fan, I don't think. And I think the organization probably has to know that on some level. It's like, yes, it makes sense. Guard the Suns picks with everything, but we also have to sell tickets. We might just lose fans that never come back, right? Because if the team's just super boring right. So there's other problems to kind of worry about here more than just asset retention. And I'm usually on the full side of asset retention because I think that's really the only way to really build. But I in talking about the team every day, and we come here and we talk about the team every day, and everyone out there is watching the team every day, and that's how it is. We haven't really gone through a long version like that where it's like very little to hold on to. And the Nets are dangerously close to being that version where there's just very little to get excited about. And that's a problem.
And it's, when you talk about these, like some of those teams that you listed there, it's one thing to be, every year we're a 45 to 48 win kind of team, right? And we're in the playoffs. And some years we win that first round and get bounced out in the second. Some years we take them to a 7-game series, right? That type of team, I can be excited about year over year, right? I can come back to the well and say, well, maybe we go on a little bit of a run here, and you're waiting to add that little piece. And when does, not even superstars, but just what's that guy in free agency for 1 year that you go grab or at the trade deadline? Whereas where the Nets are right now, at least in theory, is to your point of, 500-ish, maybe a little bit over. Very, very limited chance to beat a team in a 7-game series in the first round of the playoffs, microscopic probably. And that's the part that you don't want to live in. And even with these play-in games now and the play-in, 7 to 10 seed, even that, there's actually something, probably a connotation that gets attached when you are the 9th seed and lose the 1 game and get bounced. That probably is worse than not making it into the play-in tournament kind of scenario for the playoffs as well. So
good call. Yeah,
you do. Yeah, exactly. You're kind of in that weird murky waters in that regard. So that is why I say, before I think we cap off with just what I think the Nets are going to do, and that is, I said Donovan Mitchell maybe is not the perfect player. And I just did this really quick on the fly as the example. If OG Anunoby gets talked about all the time now, and it's 3 first-round picks they're looking for from Toronto. Okay, maybe that's what it is. I don't know what Donovan Mitchell would cost. Maybe they're just going to stay competitive. They're winning basketball games right now. This is just the what if. You can go get Donovan Mitchell and OG Anunoby and throw away a whole bunch of picks to both of these teams. Send Spencer Dinwiddie out to the Raptors. Send Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal out to Cleveland. Done. The money adds up. And all of a sudden you have not only a player like Donovan Mitchell, who is very talented, but may not be at 27, 28 years old. You also get a young core guy that this team in Toronto is willing to part ways with. Would it deplete all of your draft capital or close to it? Probably. But it also would set this new timeline that 3-4 years from now, 5 years from now, you'd say, and now we're in control of our own stuff. We make our own decisions. But for this 3-4 year window, we were high level competitive. We were a second round playoff team, taking some of these guys really to the brink. I don't know if that's the perfect combination of dudes, but the point is you can make that money line up pretty easily on some players that are being talked about in trade circles.
Yeah. And I think that like the Nets are, I mean, we can talk about what's going to happen here, but that is the more likely scenario of what the Nets are considering here. I think that like, I think they're not going to want to part with, as much as we talked about it, I think like logically it makes a lot of sense. I was actually shocked at the number of people we threw this out to, whether it's like Nets insider people, just like, hardcore fans. Like we threw this out to a lot of people to discuss and just to have people out there. The actual like lack of pushback that came on the trading, I was shocked by it actually, which made me realize like, man, maybe this does have real legs. Like maybe you could even survive the fan base doing this, something like this, right? Like in this one specific,
because they're seeing the sample in front of them this year, right? So now you've given them the 500-ish kind of team, or get control of your picks back.
Right, exactly. But in the end, I mean, like, what's the reality of the situation? I think the reality lives, and I think I'm gonna guess you agree with this too, is that it lives much closer to the use some assets now to be a little better, right? And because that's a little easier to sell, and maybe it's not a 1A superstar, but it's like a 1B, 1C kind of guy. And Mitchell's the guy that gets talked about. All these guys, if it's not him, it doesn't take long for someone else to shake loose, right? It's just that this is how the NBA works. I mean, like people are joking this weekend about trading back for Kevin Durant because that's going south. I mean, like I don't think they're not clearly not going to do that.
But I do love the idea though. But I do love the idea that that's going and buying back Kevin Durant, being like, "We'll give you pennies on the dollar for him." It
just doesn't take much. It just doesn't take much. Like it just doesn't take much for these teams. Only one team can win, and everyone else is disappointed. And one of these guys will come loose here. It's just like unclear who. But I think that like the most likely scenario is the Nets are going to go that route, spend a little bit of this, seemingly treasure trove they have from Phoenix, knowing sort of like how Houston knows that they'll never fully control it. So it will just never be worth the most and take some W's in the short term. I don't think it's right, but I think that's probably the most likely scenario.
And that's why I think and I agree with you. I agree with you on that. And that's why I think in the coming weeks, we'll start to talk about who are these players that could shake free. What is the price point that it's worth it to sacrifice some of those future draft picks to improve this team and make them closer to a 45-win team this year, closer to a team that can maybe win a playoff series and change the narrative around a team that is going to struggle to make the playoffs to a team that's entrenched in it over the next 2 or 3 seasons.
All right, we're going to get out of here. Much appreciated, everyone that continues to listen to the podcast, or either over on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, wherever it is. Make sure you like and subscribe. Leave us a review at any of those aforementioned podcast spots, and make sure you subscribe over on YouTube as well.
Right or wrong, most times merely depends on perspective. That's Umofa Apolki.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.